Gentlemen, today is September the 8th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Heckin' solid, you?
What was that?
Heckin' solid. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing good. Just kind of tired because I ate too much today.
Did you have anything yummy?
I had some leftovers from yesterday. Some, what would you call them? Sliced potatoes with green peas, rather, and mixed with lots of cheese
Mmm.
and pieces of sausage.
Mmm. Very rich.
Oh, yeah.
Let's go.
Not very good for the heart, but
That's okay.
it's certainly very filling.
Moderation in all things, even moderation. It is fair to feast sometimes for morale. I support that.
Yeah, I just wasn't expecting it to knock me on my ass quite so much.
Yeah.
Must be getting older.
Drink water too.
I have been doing that.
Good.
I'm not very good about dieting, but I am good about water. Drink it every day. I
Speaking
had
of
some
which,
hot dogs too.
we hydrate.
Oh yeah.
My BG3 solo run is plugging along. It's a little bit behind ours.
Mm.
I rescued Daniel and then got them to reunite or whatever. And then I've
cool.
also beaten the 3 Toll House bosses. And then I just stepped into the mausoleum. I think I
Gotcha.
maybe did the first puzzle. So I think I'm a little bit ahead in the Gauntlet of Shar. I don't remember how far we got in that.
Oh, we didn't get to it at all. We were
Okay.
just cleaning out Moonrise Castle. Or
Oh,
tower,
yeah.
rather.
That's the difference. I didn't attack anyone in Moonrise. But we had definitely made a big mess.
Yeah. Yeah, from my perspective, it's easier to do it then than to face them all in the battle later. when you
Yeah,
have
because they're
all of the
prepared and there are
Harpers with
more
you.
elites in the room. I noticed that when we were taking that fight in there, it's like just a bunch of normal people standing around as well. Whereas in the event fight, it's everyone in a good battle formation, like ready to fight you, and you're funneled in, and they get to chew you down. It's a bad start to the
Yeah,
fight.
yeah, very much so. So, yeah, we shouldn't face pretty much anybody at this
Mm-hmm.
point. We've got a couple more people to clear out in the second floor.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I generally let the orc lady live because I'm afraid that if I go after her, then it'll lock me out of the quests that she gives.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, if the only person you're facing in the battle with the Harpers is that one orc lady, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
That's a manageable fight.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, we didn't get to it. We just killed everybody last time and then quit.
True. Well, today I have a earlier hard stop, but I do have time to make some progress in it. How's the world? There was a unfortunate shooting in the U.S. that, like, honestly surprised me in how much of my YouTube feed that it ate up. It took a whole row. Like, they promoted it with a whole row of videos, like 6 all the way across. And a bunch of people were kind of discussing that and, like, motives and the drama of why they did it and stuff. And I feel like a huge part of why people do this is because they get an enormous amount of attention, like more media attention from more people than most people will get in their lifetimes by doing something very villainous. But there is that kind of mad bandit mindset that a human can get into where they're after a really extreme goal because they're at an extreme low in one of the main areas of fulfillment, of being okay because you feel included, at least in some sense. Because we're social creatures, and if we don't get enough attention, we get very grouchy and upset. So humans are the same way, and we reach a breaking point, and in this mass media world, someone just gets funneled a ton of attention with what our media news cycle does. It's almost like there should be 18 plus rating or something on some of the like super tragedy stuff, because I feel like there might be a psychological angle for playing into why people do that kind of thing.
Oh, for sure. But, you know, the FBI tried to profile, I guess this isn't a school shooting per se, but the FBI tried to profile school shooters in order to kind of get an idea of, you know, warning signs and that kind of thing. And they couldn't do it. Like there wasn't really any consistent variables that appeared often enough across shootings to allow them to construct a profile that would have fit all of them, or even most of them. So, you know, really, the motivations for random shootings like this tend to be highly variable, highly dependent on the individual. So, you know, he could have been doing it for attention, but he could have also just been mad at the world and wanted revenge against some abstract notion of society. It could have been any number of things.
True.
He could have just been high as fuck. Like, who knows? I don't think they've caught him yet. So, you know, we're not going to really know anything for a while, probably. It kind of reminds me of the Washington, D.C. shootings like 20 years ago. Do you remember those?
No.
He was a sniper, and he was killing civilians at like just random places like gas stations and whatnot from a distance.
Why?
So nobody like saw him doing it. They just knew that he was like shooting people to death, and it took them like a week or two or something like that to actually finally catch him. So that's
What was his
probably the
motive?
time. What was his motive? I think he was just like a radical. I think he was like a black nationalist or something like that. I don't quite remember the details. It's been a while. But I bring him up just because of the time frame. Like it again, like just took a while to catch him, because if you're just running around randomly shooting people, especially at a distance, you know, that makes it hard to catch you, relatively speaking. It's actually easier to catch people if they kill somebody they know, because then that kind of narrows down the list of likely perps.
Yeah.
You're a lot more likely to be killed by a family member than a random stranger. So the cops tend to home in on, you know, people you're relatively close to. If you die, you know, if you're violently murdered, those are the people that they'll be looking at first. But again, if it's just like some random dude, then it's much, much harder, and it just takes much more time. So I have no idea what his motive could have been. We just won't know. Like, there's no evidence right now, at least none that I'm aware of. So any commentary to the effect of trying to rationalize it or explain it is just pure speculation at this point.
Yeah, that's it. Well, what else happened this week?
What else did happen this week? There was a shooting in Israel, on the border of Israel and Jordan, since we're talking about shootings. There was a Jordanian citizen who went to the border crossing between Jordan and Israel. And there's only one, so it was the border crossing. There weren't any others. So this guy went there and he just started shooting people. And he ended up killing 3 Israeli citizens before he was shot dead by security. So the Israeli government, of course, was upset about that. They closed down the border crossing, and they're launching an investigation to try to figure out what happened. Probably just random, you know, just some guy hyped up on hatred against Israel for maybe the Gaza war, or maybe just in general. Who knows? You know, we'll find out later, probably. But for now, just more violence, basically, in a region rife with it. There were some big protests in France. Did you hear about those at all?
No. What are they protesting?
Yeah, so if you recall, in the election that was held in France this past year, there was no one party that emerged as the clear-cut leader. You know, no one group actually managed to get a majority in the parliament. And so that made it a little difficult then to determine who should form a government, right? So, you know, the president, for one, has to invite a given political coalition to form a government, and then that coalition has to secure a majority of votes in parliament in order to actually form a government. So that nobody had any idea, like, what the next government would look like correspondingly, and everybody was watching Emmanuel Macron, president of France, to see how he was going to manage that. because he doesn't really like the far right, which famously has kind of been ascendant in France for 10, 20 years now. But he's also not on good terms with the left. The main left-wing coalition in particular hates him because of all the market-oriented reforms he's been trying to implement the past 5 some years. So Macron was in a difficult position because his own party did better than was expected, but it's still not a majority, and it's actually smaller than the left-wing coalition. Mind you, the left-wing coalition actually won the most votes out of any party or coalition that ran in the election. So finally, after I think several months actually of having a caretaker government, which is an unusually long time to not have a new government after an election, he has decided to appoint Bernier. I don't know if you remember him from back in the day, but Bernier was the EU lead negotiator in the Brexit talks with the United Kingdom. So he's a name that came up a lot, in news stories about Brexit back in the day. So he's a familiar face, he's a familiar name, but the thing that has people riled up is that he's a member of the Republican Party in France. That had been the main center-right party in France, and had been like one of the dominant parties for many decades, but over the past 10, 15 some years, it's been in a steep decline, right? Famously, Western politics has been, kind of afflicted, or if you prefer, experienced populist movements in pretty much every country to varying degrees. And in France, the burden, well, not the burden per se, but the impact of that fell disproportionately on the center-right party. The center-left parties haven't done great either, but the center-right party in particular is a shadow of its former self. So it was a small party. It did not win a lot of seats in the recent election. And despite that fact, Macron is allowing has invited one of their guys to form a new government. And it's not clear if they're going to be able to get enough votes. Again, they need a majority in parliament to make that happen. Obviously, the left-wing coalition is not interested. They think that they should have the opportunity to form a new government. But Macron has basically snubbed them and went with this other sort of strange choice that I suspect he's hoping will form the basis of a coalition between his own party, the Republican Party, or what's left of it, and then also perhaps some votes from Marine Le Pen's party, National Rally. That's the far right party. And, because the Republican Party and Macron's party don't have enough votes to get a majority in parliament. So they're going to need some votes from either the left-wing coalition or National Rally. And, given how pissed off the left coalition is with Macron, it's probably going to have to be National Rally. And that's actually exacerbated the protests, because that kind of implies that there's a low-key implicit coalition between Macron and National Rally. He said that he won't work for them and that he wants to work to keep them out of power. But at the same time, if you're dependent on some of their votes to form a new government, that is a kind of soft coalition in a sense. And that does seem like hypocrisy to a lot of Macron's critics. So supporters of the left-wing coalition specifically have hit the streets. They're saying that the president is ignoring the will of the people. Again, they say their coalition won the most votes. They should get the chance to form a government. And they think that Macron's party, I assume, should help them to form a coalition government that would be led by their coalition, the left-wing coalition. And so that's not going to happen, probably, or at least that's the way it seems at the moment. And so they're going to just try to apply as much pressure to try to get their preferred outcome as possible. Given how stubborn Macron has proven to be over the course of his political career, I suspect he's going to ignore them. That's kind of one of his big main plays in politics. When one of his proposals meets a lot of resistance, I don't think it'll be much different here. But we'll see. For now, there's some big ticket protests going on with pretty decent support. We'll see where they go.
Interesting. Yeah, Macron seems pretty centrist with what he ends up doing.
Yeah, that's his thing. He kind of fancies himself the middle option. He kind of wants to deflect populism of both the left and the right varieties. And so he's kind of tried to become the avatar of a sort of middle way, a centrist vision for France. And he's tried to be fairly practical in how he's addressed a lot of the problems that France faces, not least of which is structural economic decline. There does need to be some reform there to generate more growth so that people can find jobs, get better wages and whatnot, and also pay more taxes that can pay for the very large, hefty French welfare state, which is kind of weighing them down, both fiscally and economically. So he's tried to address that with some economic reforms here and there, but they've been very unpopular amongst broad segments of the population, of both far right and far left varieties. And so that's kind of put him in an awkward spot. The only reason he's still around basically is because people don't want National Rally to win. That was certainly one of the main reasons people had been voting for him, kind of a protest vote, if you will. But now, his party has shrunk, and the populist forces in France, again, both the left-wing and the right-wing varieties, are the dominant political forces. And it's not clear how he's going to manage that. He can try to play kingmaker and try to extract as many concessions as possible to try to maintain relatively centrist governance in France, but it seems like a losing game at this point. So, if his centrist movement does end up failing, that does augur a kind of end-game confrontation between the far left and far right in France. And the last time they were kind of going back and forth like that was the 1930s, and I don't think anybody wants to go back to that. But we'll see.
What are the issues that define the left and the right in France? Like, what do they care about and fighting for?
So there are kind of two answers to that. One is the traditional answer, and then one is the new answer, right? So traditionally, left and right have kind of fought in France over the same kinds of stuff that the left and right have fought over in other countries, principally economic issues. So, for example, the left wants a larger state, more protections for workers, more rights, a more expansive welfare state, that kind of stuff. And then the right, by contrast, tends to be more critical of that. They want more free markets, a slimmer state, more efficiency, lower taxes, etc. Keep in mind that while this dynamic does kind of color politics in most developed countries, if not countries in the Western world generally, the center of the political spectrum of different countries kind of lays in different parts of that spectrum, parts of the broader spectrum of politics in the Western world. So France obviously has a political center that is to the left of, say, the United States or the United Kingdom, for example.
Yeah.
So the right in France is generally much more tolerant, if not desirous, of statist policies than you would ever see in, like, the Republican Party here in the United States. Mm-hmm. So they're not dead set against things like a welfare state amongst French conservatives. But they are, in general, opposed to the extent of statist policy that the left in France would want. Mm-hmm. So that's more the traditional answer. And of course, they have culture wars and, that kind of thing too. But, that's kind of boring for me as an economist, to be blunt. But to kind of give you a full answer, like, yeah, they do have the same culture wars where they have, like, traditional socially conservative voters versus sort of the more new age style cultures that came out of the 1960s, counterculture, and that have moved increasingly into the mainstream ever since. So that's the kind of culture war stuff that they have. And again, these are sort of the traditional style of politics. There's also issues around foreign policy and immigration and that kind of thing, but traditionally those were second fiddle to, like, the bigger issues, which were more culture war issues and economic issues. Now, more recently, in the current generation of French politics, it's taken on a much more populist hue, again, much like the rest of the Western world. So now the right is less about smaller government. In fact, they actually want to maintain the government rather than shrink it. If you look at the National Rally's campaign platform, they're actually pretty okay with having a large state. And they blame, neoliberalism as well as ineffectual leftist leaders kind of for hobbling that welfare state. And they think that if they're given power, then they can totally fix all of that. They're not entirely clear how they're going to do that, but that is what they say.
Is the right still anti-immigration, like in the U.S.?
Yeah, anti-immigration is a big one. They think there's been too many people not of French descent who have been coming in and are making up and are now comprising too large a proportion of the French society, which maybe wouldn't be as big a deal, but they say that they're not assimilating. So it's especially aggravating for some of the more socially conservative French nationalist types on the far right. So immigration is a major issue. Environmentalism has increasingly become one as well, weirdly. Weirdly for me. I mean, it still seems strange to me, but that's politics changes. So, you just kind of have to get used to that. So in the case of the far right in France, they're very skeptical about green policy. They think it's unnecessary because they think the burden of the green transition is falling disproportionately on the working class in France. And so they blame out-of-touch bureaucrats for continuing the green transition and green policies, despite the fact that that burden exists. And whenever anybody, again, this is a French far-right narrative. They say that whenever anybody criticizes the bureaucracy or the status quo powers for doing this, they get shut down. So from their perspective, as they frame it, they say that the authorities don't actually care about the working man and just want to impose the green transition on people regardless of the cost. And so part of their explanation of how they're going to fix the economy and regenerate growth to maintain the French welfare state is by getting rid or at least curtailing the green transition policies that they blame for inhibiting economic growth. So skepticism about environmentalism and I guess climate change generally, as well as wanting to significantly reduce immigration, seem to be two of the big planks that they have as far as campaign platform. The left, meanwhile, hasn't really changed as much. Their thing is just doubling down on the stuff they've always wanted, but asking for more. Even higher taxes, greater power for workers in the workplace. Basically just more state. And I know that's a simplification. I'm sure there's more nuance to it than that. But in general, there's not a whole lot of difference between the populist left now in France and previous iterations of left-wing politics. It's just been ramped up to a degree that would probably not work if they actually did get power. I think they would probably be disappointed, but that also doesn't really matter, right? That's not the era we're in. So roughly, that's a breakdown of the issues that they're competing over. And there's some of the traditional politics still in play. There is still commentary and debate about economic issues and culture wars. Obviously, the far right in France still heavily emphasizes culture wars. Probably not as much as the American right does these days, but it's more in the wheelhouse now of French politics than it used to be. Somebody from France listening, feel free to correct me. To give the usual disclaimer, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, so if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will get the feedback later. And I do enjoy being corrected and getting all of the feedback. It's always a lot of fun and very informative.
Thank you, chat, for your corrections.
Yeah, but that is my understanding of French politics.
Cool. Bit different from the US, but some similar themes. Less financial regulation, I think, is one of the key elements. For the right-leaning voters, regardless of country. But you are saying that they relatively would be more okay with a statist approach where there is big government.
Yeah. I don't know that the financial sector matters as much in Europe because they don't have a big financial sector on the continent. A lot of Europe's financial sector is in London. They do have other smaller financial centers, but they're not nearly as politically relevant as the financial sector in either the UK or the US. And so that means that there's not really as much demand in those polities for either more regulation or less regulation for the financial sector. It's just not as big a deal.
Gotcha. So we'll see what happens with France.
I did note that the United Kingdom implemented a partial arms ban on Israel. They say that they're concerned that the weapons may end up being used against civilians.
Oh.
So that's a small gesture, a little bit of pressure. Again, it's only partial. And I don't think Israel gets a whole lot of weapons from the UK anyway. And I don't even know that the weapons they get from the UK are the kinds they're using in Gaza right now. So this could be a largely symbolic action by the government, probably done more for political reasons than to actually impact events on the ground in Palestine. Be my guess. But it is an interesting sign of the trend line there changing. Used to be they wouldn't even really do that. So now you've seen both the United States and the United Kingdom try to apply pressure in the form of inhibiting arms transfers of one kind or another to Israel. Let's see. I think those were the main items that I had. It wasn't especially eventful as a week. It wasn't an especially eventful week. Little things here and there. I think, have you been following the interest rate drama?
No.
I guess I shouldn't call it drama, but, you know, it is bothering markets that the Fed hasn't lowered rates yet. So there is like some market tension because of that. There's not really much they can do about it. Like the Fed famously focuses more on, you know, macroeconomic data in order to, you know, decide whether or not to raise or lower interest rates. But markets have been kind of expecting it for a while, and they keep being disappointed. And so that's led to some churn in markets, because every time the markets think that the rates are going to go down and then they don't, then there has to be a correction, and that obviously costs people money. So some of the data, I think last month, I'm talking economic data released by the Federal Reserve here, some of the data released kind of suggested the economy might be tightening up a little bit, slowing down a little bit. People were taking longer to find new jobs after they left previous jobs. They were leaving the jobs they had less frequently. So that kind of suggested that maybe the labor market was starting to struggle a little more. And I think unemployment rates kind of ticked up a little bit. So that had markets thinking, okay, well, this time, for real, they're going to lower interest rates. Because now the unemployment rate has shifted, and the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. It's not just inflation they focus on. It's also, they're also supposed to focus on unemployment. So, you know, the fact that unemployment had started to nudge up a little bit had markets thinking the Fed might finally change its mind about lowering interest rates. So that's kind of where we are. I'm a little dubious. I still don't think the Fed is like super excited to lower interest rates, given that the economy is still doing decent. Like, we're hardly in a recession, right? You know, we're doing pretty good. And so I suspect from the Fed's perspective, you know, the hawks, specifically the inflation hawks, would actually prefer to raise rates even higher, so that when there eventually does come a downturn in the economy, they have more room to lower interest rates. Basically, more room to try to impact the economy and have a counter-cyclical monetary policy. Because it's kind of hard to, you know, lower interest rates in a way that significantly impacts the economy if you can only lower them by like 0.5%. You know, when we had super low interest rates, there wasn't really anywhere they could go as far as downward lowering of the rates. So if there had been some kind of economic crisis, they would have had to have relied on, you know, just weird niche shit, you know, things like quantitative easing and other little parlor tricks that they've innovated over the past 20 years to try to improve the economy, impact the economy, have a counter-cyclical monetary policy without being able to significantly lower rates. So inflation hawks in particular were very critical about that, but they didn't really have too much of an argument to be made because inflation never really got to be a big problem until after the pandemic, right? So after that, the inflation hawks had to be taken more seriously and rates finally did rise. So I suspect we're kind of right now having a similar debate within the Federal Reserve between the hawks that want rates to be even higher and the doves that think that they should at least consider lowering rates so that the economy doesn't end up in recession next year because rates are too tight or something. I don't know. I don't think there's a great argument for lowering rates right now. Just why I'm a little skeptical that it'll actually happen, but we'll see. That's what's being watched right now in the economic sphere. And not just by Americans. The interest rate that the Fed sets impacts the global economy. So, everybody's keeping their eye on that. We shall see. You'll hear about it if and when it happens, regardless of what the decision is. It'll definitely make some waves.
Gotcha.
Makes you pine for the days when nobody gave a shit. The Federal Reserve and its interest rates have always been important, but for much of the 90s and aughts, it wasn't something that was as unpredictable as it is now. And so that made it much easier to plan around it.
Many people have strong opinions on the Fed.
Oh, yeah. Was there anything in particular you wanted to get to?
It was a relatively quiet week, I think, in terms of people's banter. Is there a Russia/Ukraine development?
None that I'm aware of. Pakarov is still going. Kursk is still going. Not much else besides.
Gotcha.
Did we talk about Narendra Modi going to Ukraine last time? I think we did.
Yeah, it sounds familiar.
Yeah. So not much came out of that, but I think that's the only big international thing that happened with Ukraine. So no, not really any updates there. It's still a meat grinder, unfortunately. Hopefully things will change a bit next year. But for now, we're definitely kind of in a trough as far as Ukrainian fortune goes.
Trough.
Trough. Thank you.
Welcome. One of my few uses during World Discussion with Agent Smith. Chat, if you have a question, feel free to pass it along as well. There was someone last time who I recall saying, more Australia news, please. Sorry, not much happens here. So...
Yeah, that's the trouble. I mean, the bigger issue, I'm sure there's stuff that happens there, honestly. But the bigger issue is that in the news outlets that I generally follow to keep track of world affairs, Australia kind of gets short shrift. BBC World News is kind of my default go-to just for keeping track of big stuff going on. And then I've got a couple other outlets that are more region-specific or issue-specific to try to keep track of things in more detail. But the BBC actually, on their world news page, gives Australia its own tab, right? Different regions have their own sub-pages that have news for that region. Australia gets its own, but they don't really update it very often. And so the trouble with a sub-page that doesn't get updated often is that you eventually kind of get into the habit of just not using it, right? There's only so many times you can go there and just see the same story before you kind of give up. So what I ought to do is I ought to just try to find a dedicated Australia outlet, or maybe a dedicated Oceania outlet, and just try to have that in my rotation just to keep track of things. But I haven't done that, so I tend to be pretty light on Australia news correspondingly. I think things have gotten better there, if I'm not mistaken, because I remember there had been a lot of political blood sport going on for a while. I think they had like 10 years where they had a new prime minister every other year. So there was an immense amount of churn and discord, especially within the parties. People kept stabbing each other in the back. I think eventually that quieted down. I think this new guy has had the post for the longest in a while. I shouldn't call him a new guy. I guess he's been in office a couple of years now, so he's not new, but in my head, he still feels like the new guy. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but I think he's Labour Party, if I'm not mistaken. Seems to be reasonably popular at the moment.
Interesting. How's the situation in Myanmar/Burma been developing? Same.
Actually, I did have an update for that. What did I do with it? Oh, yeah. So do you remember the Rohingya?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they've got a couple different militias, but the main one is the Rohingya Solidarity Organization, the RSO. And the RSO actually just recently announced that they're going to form an understanding, as they call it. I want to call it an alliance, but it seems to be softer than that. They still don't really trust each other. So they're going to form an understanding, quote unquote, with the military, which again is the government right now in Burma. The military controls the government. Now, this is an unexpected event, because those of you who may be familiar with Burma's history know that when the Rohingya genocide was happening, not even all that long ago, just a couple of years ago, it was the Burmese military that was leading that. So one might think that a militia representing a people being obliterated systematically by their government would not likely enter into some kind of alliance with that government. But that's exactly what's happened. And the reason they've done that is because they have a common enemy, which is the Arakan Army, which is the main rebel group in Western Burma. So the Arakan Army is largely manned, I guess would be the word, is largely manned by locals from the Western regions. And for those of you, again, who remember the Rohingya genocide, you know that a lot of it, while it was led and supported by the government, was actually carried out by local militias that were anti-Muslim, anti-Rohingya, generally Buddhist nationalists, actually. Kind of a weird contradictory turn of phrase, but that was the reality on the ground. So a lot of these Buddhist nationalists joined the rebellion against the military government when the military government deposed Aung Suu Kyi's civilian government a couple years ago. And the trouble is that while they do want democracy and want to get rid of the military, they also carried their prejudices against the Rohingya with them. So at the same time that they're fighting the government, they've also been engaging in violence against the Rohingya in Western Burma. And so that's put pressure on the Rohingya communities in Western Burma on two fronts. You know, obviously they don't like the military, but they're also not on good terms with the locals. So what do you do? Like, there's no good choices for you. And so this particular militia anyway, again, the largest one amongst the Rohingya communities in Burma, has decided to cast in their lot with the military government. And it's kind of a risky move. I mean, obviously, if they align with the rebels, the military comes down on them. And of course, if the rebels lose, then they are going to get even more attention, unwanted attention from the government. So that's not great. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to frame it, the rebels in Western Burma made that decision for them. The Rohingya, and specifically the RSO, actually did reach out to rebels in Western Burma in an attempt to form an alliance, and that attempt failed. They were outright rejected. And so, having been blocked off from their preferred ally, they've kind of defaulted to the only remaining possible power they could ally with, who might be able to protect them, that being the government. But of course, that's risky, because if the government loses the civil war, then they're going to face the wrath of the militias. The same ones that rebuffed them before are going to seek retribution against them for having allied with their enemies. And again, they already kind of wanted to kill them, so this is going to make that worse if that does end up coming to pass. So basically, damned if they do, damned if they don't. There's just no way out for them. they're trying to defend their communities, but they have no cards to play. You know, it's a small minority. It's not a wealthy minority. Like, they've got nothing to work with. So it's not looking good for them. You can think of this as a desperation play, basically.
Mm-hmm.
That's about all I had for Burma. That was the main item that I picked up on. Otherwise, events continue apace. You know, the government has not been able to take any land, but I don't think they've lost a whole lot recently. You know, there have been advances over the past year by the rebels, but they haven't been consistent in those advances. So while the military has lost a lot of land, they still maintain control of the core territory of Burma, which is where most of the people live. So they're still doing okay. They could recover from this point. You know, this is hardly the end game, but at the same time, the fact that they haven't been able to reverse losses suggests that they're kind of strained beyond their capacity.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dynamic situation. We'll see how the equilibrium goes. But for now, the military is definitely on the back foot.
Gotcha. Question from chat. How do you feel about U.S. interest rates?
How do I feel about them?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't feel any particular way about them. As an economist, you know, you just try to adjust them as best you can. You try to adjust them as best you can in order to have the desired impact as a function of how the economy is doing, right? You know, so that's the technocratic answer, and you know that's how the Fed has tried to manage it. So, if you're asking me what my opinion as an economist on what that should be, you know, whether they should be adjusting it upwards or downwards, I would be all for just keeping it where it is. You know, interest rate hikes are not going to be popular. They're going to be disruptive. I think it would be better to do that when the economy is stronger, especially in terms of the labor force. Because the labor force has kind of eaten shit for a while now, you know, between inflation and COVID and all of the other disruptions. Like, it's been rough. So they could use a period of stability to try to recover from all that. And I kind of sympathize too with the inflation hawk perspective that, you know, lowering rates right now when the economy is still pretty decent is not necessarily the move. So, I mean, I'm not an expert. Just because I'm a trained economist doesn't mean I know all the ins and outs of, you know, central banking. So, but based off of what I know, you know, I would advocate for just keeping them where they are. I see a lot of complaining about how interest rates should be lower, largely coming from the financial sector. And that's because they make more money when rates are lower, because they can invest on margin. They can borrow money and invest in stuff, or borrow money and then use it to borrow even more money. And there's lots of financial engineering they do to kind of turn cheaply borrowed money into profits. And they can make more money doing that when rates are lower. So I kind of see a lot of self-interest motivating the financial sector's bleeding about interest rates not being low enough. And that makes me kind of just blow them off generally. You can't ignore them. You know, it's a very powerful interest group here in the United States. You know, when they talk, you kind of can't help but hear them. But as far as the legitimacy of the argument that rates should be lower, I think it's kind of weak, honestly. Doesn't mean I think rates should be hiked, but I don't think lowering rates is like the best move right now. I would want to see more data to kind of justify it. Oh.
Chad
You
says thank
mentioned
you for
a
your
hard
opinion.
what?
Chad said thank you for your opinion.
Oh, yeah, for what it's worth. I generally don't do opinion stuff on here. I don't think anybody really cares about that. It's generally better, I think, for everybody if I just try to stick to what's going on, more fact-based stuff, or at least as close as I can get to the facts as my memory allows me. Sometimes I screw that up, but that's the objective. But I was going to ask, what was the hard deadline you mentioned? You wanted to go to bed early?
Yeah, 9 p.m. my time, so 11 your time.
Gotcha.
Yes.
see, I think I saw a question. Yeah. Let's see. Christianity went through a bunch of civil wars and schisms to evolve into its current state, which is rather neutered compared to, say, its form in the 11th century. It seems like Islam needs to go through a similar kind of evolution. But I wonder how quickly that evolution can occur. What might liberal democracies do to speed up that process? It has gone through that process. You know, Islam, despite being younger, has just as much wrenching drama and reform movements as Christianity has had. You know, I think one of the issues, if you want to call it that, that Islam has had is that they did not have the benefit of a centralized authority. Islam is much more decentralized than Catholicism. And, you know, Protestant Christianity definitely shifted away from that model. But there was still that sort of organized core to Christianity that could kind of act as the main avatar for the religion. Islam didn't have that, like, really ever. You know, they had legal scholars. What do they call them? Hell. I forget the technical name, but there's actually different judicial philosophies within Islam. And those are kind of more what governs the type of Islam that is generally practiced in a given region. It's actually pretty interesting. I think there's 4 or 5 different schools. And I had assumed when I first learned about them that it would be that the oldest school of law in Islam would be the predominant one in the core territory of Islam, so like the Arabian Peninsula. And then as you got geographically further away from the Arabian Peninsula, then you would see the newer schools become more and more prominent. And I was wrong. It was actually the reverse. It's actually in the Arabian Peninsula, again, the core territory of Islam, that the newest schools of Islam are the most prominent. And then the further away from that core territory, the more prominent the older schools become. So I think that illustrates that reform movements in Islam have not only occurred, but been successful, right? You know, the core territory of Islam has upgraded and modified its beliefs over time. So it's not like stagnant per se. You know, keep in mind, like, the most backwards forms and practices of Islam do not define Islam as a whole, right? The Islamic world is, like, really big. There's lots and lots of different peoples and countries and territories that practice Islam. So you can't just point at, like, what was the name? The Salafite in Saudi Arabia and say, okay, that's Islam. You can't point at the Taliban in Afghanistan and say, okay, well, that's Islam, you know, or Islamic State or any of the sort of jihadi terrorist groups that the United States encountered in, like, Iraq, for example. So, you know, those are part of the Islamic world for sure. Like, nobody can deny that, but that doesn't mean they're representative of it. And I think Americans kind of get a biased view of what Islam is. You know, because of that disproportionate exposure, they get to, like, the most violent conflict zones in the Muslim world. You know, if you go to places like India or Indonesia, for example, or Malaysia, you generally see, like, a much more chill form of Islam. Or even in Northern Africa. Like, Islam there, especially in Northwestern Africa, tends to be much more chill. They've had issues, but, you know, those issues are not necessarily because of Islam, but because of general political instability. I would point out here, you know, I'm not trying to make the argument that Islam doesn't have any problems and doesn't have an issue with violence or certain regions being backwards. But I would point out that the reason that the Muslim world has issues with political violence has to do with, one, the political culture of the region, especially in the Middle East, and 2, it has to do with actually mostly secular authoritarian governments in the region, most of which took power in the mid-20th century, being really shit at governance. Like, that's the main reason that Islamism really ascended in the Middle East, starting mostly in the late 1970s and then into the 1980s. By that point, those secular pan-Arab nationalist governments that had formed in the 1950s and 60s had been around for several decades, and their record spoke for itself. and it did not speak well. Like, they were generally very violent towards their own people, mostly. They were not tolerant of dissent. They did not, what's the word I want? Inculcate a political culture of liberty or freedom of speech. You know, it was a very top-down hierarchical political order that most of the governments in the Middle East imposed on their people. And again, these are mostly secular and nationalist governments. Like, they've just screwed things up so badly that invariably people started to turn on them. But when they turned on them, there wasn't really much of a civil society to offer a kind of liberal Enlightenment alternative, right? Because they had choked that out, right? They didn't want that to appear, so they suppressed it. And they also generally mismanaged their economies, so there generally wasn't much of a middle class to begin with. So there was a lot of problems there, and the result is that the only real viable political alternative was conservative Islam, right? Because that's part of the political culture in the region as well. Like, it's sort of the foundation there. You know, if nothing else is working, especially none of the new stuff, you can always go back to what worked before. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the Middle East in particular, that means going back to previous, more theocratic forms of governance. And that hasn't really worked especially well either, but the reason it became a problem, especially in terms of like jihadis and whatnot, is because of those governments, the previous governments, just failing. And the West played a role in that too, you know, cultivating relationships with states in the region that were largely transactional. You know, those transactions generally did not involve pressuring them to improve governance. So there was some enabling going on there. You know, I don't want to. One of the things I try to do on here is to not deny people free agency. So, you know, one of the criticisms I have of Western critics of the both left and right variety is that they tend to assume that the West is more powerful and influential than it is. You know, they tend to ascribe outcomes in the developing world to things that the West did. And in reality, locals actually have a lot of agency around the developing world, and they have a lot of responsibility for what happens, which is not to, you know, disavow all of the nasty shit that colonial powers did in the developing world. There's a very long list of atrocities there. So, you know, I don't want to discount that entirely, but at the same time, I think it's more affirming and more actually in keeping with how people in the developing world think of their own countries and cultures, to try to talk about them on their own terms rather than through a Western lens. And when you're talking about not only how those cultures suffer because they're inferior or whatnot, that's one Western lens. That's sort of the traditional conservative one. But then also looking at it from a colonial lens where you're ascribing every outcome to colonial oppression, that's also very disempowering. Because they actually did fight to preserve their cultures during the colonial period, for one, but then after the colonial period, they did do things wrong. They did have agency, and there were things that just didn't work. And, you know, just trying to say those things didn't work because of the West kind of helps the responsible authorities in those countries ignore and evade responsibility. And that's not helpful to them, right? There needs to be more accountability, not less. So recognizing free agency where it exists, you know, that is part of my general philosophy of understanding world affairs. I try. Obviously, I'm not always going to be successful. I am a Westerner, so I have biases that I have to try to overcome. And sometimes that'll work, sometimes it won't. But I think everybody should strive, not only to understand the relevant colonial history, but also to understand people, how they understand themselves. You know, that's one of the really difficult things about truly getting to know people of a different culture. Because generally what you'll find is that a lot of the things you believe, even if you're trying to be sympathetic to them, end up actually being false, maybe even harmful to those people. So you do have to tread carefully when you're dealing with other histories, other cultures, other political issues. It's actually quite challenging in order to really do that. Mm-hmm. So that's why I say that Islamism is a problem, not because of colonialism per se, or because of some, you know, innate inferiority in Islam. A lot of it is because of pan-Arab nationalism, and more specifically, because it failed so hard in the mid-20th century. And I don't even necessarily think that's a problem with pan-Arab nationalism as an ideology. Like, in principle, it's not any different than any of the other pan-national type movements that were prominent in the 20th century. You know, Pan-Asianism, Pan-Africanism, etc. Pan-Americanism was a thing for a while. So Pan-Arabism, you know, Pan-Arab nationalism, not that much different. The trouble they had is that the individual leaders they had actually take control of different countries in the region, generally important ones, were not very effective. You know, they were not good at governance, not good at economic management. They were really good at securing power and holding on to it, but that was about it. And there was not really a good bench of alternatives there. I mean, even if there had been, they probably would have been killed, but still. It just was not great for the early evolution of the newly independent states in the region that they had so much trouble at the beginning there. So recovering from that is going to be a long-term project. And the sooner that succeeds, the sooner you're going to stop seeing people turn to political radical alternatives to try to address the deficiencies in the autocratic authoritarian governments that they have in the region. So again, this is a really long-winded way of saying that yes, radical Islamism has problems. A lot of it emanates from the Middle East, but that doesn't mean that cozying up to secular, quote-unquote, nationalist governments in the region is the solution, because actually those guys were the creators of the problem in the first place. And if you help them out, it's probably just going to make it worse. So just keep that in mind when people talk about the Middle East and foreign policy, because I feel like when I'm reading comments, especially on YouTube or Reddit, people don't really understand that. Anyway, how did I? Oh, right, Islam. Right. So Islam has had reform movements, right, over time. So it actually has had a similar experience as Christianity. And I think the main reason people think that it has as many problems as it's perceived to have is mostly just because of the disproportionately negative coverage that the West has had of the most violent conflict zones in the Islamic world. Most of the Islamic world is not experiencing like violent conflict right now. Like it's mostly had been Afghanistan, and then the Israel-Palestine issue, Syrian civil war, obviously. Iraq had been a problem, but you kind of can't blame the region for that, can you?
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking about the relation that for someone who browses United States news material, the only time that the Middle East makes the news is when it's bad news. They don't really have like shared cultural overlap. The language barrier is a pretty big deal, and then the religious is another big cultural barrier for Western audiences. So there isn't very much overlap in terms of wanting to browse similar content, where a lot of European stuff, they share a lot of similar themes, and a lot of them speak English, at least as a second language. So the interconnectedness is not there. So with 9/11 happening, there's definitely a negative slant just overall.
Yeah, a lot of that is actually the Arab world and some of its eccentricities, shall we say, political, cultural, economic, what have you, historical. You know, even within the Arab world, there's a lot of variance. Like the Arab world not only includes Israel, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, it also includes the Gulf monarchies. You know, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait. Like these are fairly stable countries, you know, and they're obviously very wealthy. So, you know, it's not as though people generally don't pick them out and try to, you know, paint Islam as being represented by their experience. Again, it's the other countries in the region that are much more unstable. So not entirely fair there. And then, of course, North Africa, other than Libya anyway, obviously Libya is a giant clusterfuck. But Egypt, Sudan, Sudan's a big giant clusterfuck too. But Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, they're actually doing okay. They have problems, but those problems are not because of Islamism. They're because they have entrenched political elites that are fighting change. And again, that's not a problem that Islamism or terrorism caused. Oh, sorry about the cough. I'm trying to keep it under control.
You're good.
What might liberal democracies do to speed up that process? Yeah, so that's difficult, right? Because again, like I was saying earlier, it's really hard to intuitively understand another culture on its own terms. And that's really what you have to do if you want to try to encourage change in that culture. But even by doing that, you're kind of getting in trouble, because, you know, immediately anybody's response to people in another country trying to change things in your country is going to be resistance, skepticism, maybe even outrage. You know, especially if you're living in a country that has a history of being colonized, certainly by the West, you're going to be immensely skeptical of Westerners who are saying, "Oh, you need to change in a way that I find more comforting for me and my interests."
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you may not like terrorism, right? I assume everybody listening doesn't like terrorism. But that doesn't mean that, that does mean that the burden of that terrorism actually falls mostly on the people who live in that region, in the Middle East. So, however much you don't like terrorism when it happens in the West, you know, certainly of the relevant kind, Islamist terrorism, it's even worse over there, right? It's not like it's something that nobody in the region is familiar with. You know, keep in mind also that jihadis of whatever stripe, pretty much, do not think of the West as their paramount enemy, right? The West is like a secondary enemy. You know, it's an enemy for sure, and they'll go and kill people there occasionally. But the main enemy, and this is consistent across radical groups in the region, the main enemy as they see it are the states in the Middle East. The Gulf monarchies, the pan-Arab nationalist governments, all of those they see as illegitimate governments. And those are their main target. You know, that's why states in the region go so far out of their way to try to marginalize and go after even fairly nonviolent Islamist movements of one kind. Like the Egyptian military barely tolerated the Muslim Brotherhood for decades until the Arab Spring happened, and then they got into power, and then they shut that shit down. Like the Muslim Brotherhood is de facto banned. I think not even de facto. I think it's just flat banned in Egypt now, ever since the Arab Spring failed. So keep that in mind, basically. Just, yes, terrorism bad, but people in the region deal with it even more. You know, it's even harder for them. So, you know, everybody is opposed to it. And if you walk in saying, hey, you know, we get the occasional terrorist attack, so I would like you to change whole aspects of your underlying culture and society so that I can be somewhat safer, they're not going to react well to that. Nobody wants to fucking hear that. You know, they're dealing with far more violence and far more difficult and tractable problems, politically speaking, with their institutions. They want to change things to be better, but they're not going to do it just to make you somewhat less likely to experience a terrorist attack. It's extremely unlikely as it is. You know, so it was always overblown, even during the height of the war on terror. Don't even get me started on that. So, you know, the way to approach it is not to come into those, not to parachute into those societies and say, hey, I'm here to save you. Please listen to what I have to say. The way to do it is to find elements within those societies that are already fighting for change, that already want change, and to empower them. Don't speak for them or don't tell them what to say. Just listen to them, and if you think that that's a positive force in that society, you can give them what they need. And yes, you're probably going to get conned, especially if a lot of money ends up behind it, but that wasn't the question. The question wasn't, how do I not get conned, trying to help out political movements and other societies that are aligned with my beliefs. The question was, how do we do that as Westerners? And so the way to do it is delicately. You know, find NGOs, find societies with a decent middle class, especially if you can, and just try to help them. You know, do things that empower the middle class in those societies, and when they engage in some kind of political activism, help the movement out. You know, send them money, maybe send them supplies if they're asking for it, depending on the context and circumstances. Just little things like that. Help them get the message out. Maybe don't arrest their political dissidents when they're trying to take shelter in your country, and then ship them back where they came from. You know, if somebody genuinely wants enlightenment liberalism in the region, you know, you can help that guy out by giving them a place to stay and a platform to get their message out, and maybe tell them not to end up in a Turkish embassy. That doesn't end well, as has been proven.
Good luck with your quest, and don't go to Turkish embassies. You could be killed.
Yeah, not so good. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, like, that's the way to do it. You know, a soft, indirect approach is much preferable than a more direct approach. Keep in mind during the War on Terror in the aughts, there was a big effort by the U.S. government, or at least they pretended to make a big effort. Kind of debatable how interested they actually were in it, but they wanted to try to transform the region to make it more liberal and democratic. And I think everybody kind of knows by now that was not a raging success, right? They didn't know how to do that, to be blunt, and they never figured it out because there's not really a playbook for that. If you want to knock down somebody else's military and invade their country, okay, like the US military can do that. If you want to set up a temporary government, the military can kind of do that for a while. But when you get into the realm of like abstract cultural values and beliefs and political preferences, no, the military is not going to do that. Nobody knows how to engineer that stuff. There's been lots of ideological utopian movements over the course of the 20th century, especially, that pretend to know how to engineer better societies, and they all failed.
Not even by winning the hearts and minds?
Not, not even by winning hearts and minds. That was really more about fighting the insurgency, not about transforming the culture and society.
Mm-hmm.
That was seen as a necessary prerequisite for changing society, but hearts and minds was more about pacification than actual change.
Mm-hmm.
We never even really got to a good point where we even had society stable enough to start doing that, but efforts were still made. And it just didn't work, right? You can't engineer society. Spectacular failures abound across history. Like, it just doesn't really work. Cultural evolution is something that happens mostly organically. There are things you can do to try to steer it, mostly by building strong centralized states with competent bureaucrats and rule of law. That especially helps inculcate middle classes that demand better institutions, hold them to account, and generally want a stable society that they can thrive in and maintain and pursue their interests in. But in general, that process plays out the same regardless of circumstances. Like, if you have a centralized state that is trying to stabilize things so that a middle class can flourish, or if you have a middle class that flourishes in spite of your state being run by idiots who aren't doing that at all, like, the evolution of that society is going to be pretty similar, because in general, middle classes around the world behave very similarly. Even when they're being retrograde and backwards looking, like, when there's a lot of change in a society, stemmed by generally lots of economic change, increases in standards of living, urbanization, what have you. Even in those cases, when that happens, there's generally a backlash because people feel threatened. They feel their traditional values eroding as people kind of move away from them, move away from those values and take advantage of the freedom and discretion that is offered by an urban lifestyle. So the pattern generally is that not only does economic development augur labor movements, countercultures, what you would consider like modernist urban living values and culture, it also inculcates the opposite. It also inculcates a kind of nationalist, traditionalist movement of some kind to try to shore up traditional values against what they see as an onslaught of change. And generally, those don't go well. I think there's been some famous examples in Europe, but they're not always that violent either. It's a perfectly legitimate perspective to have. Sometimes the new forces that are augured by urbanization and economic development go too far or are unhinged, or sometimes they're even criminal in nature. So it's not unreasonable to want to try to contain some of the further reaches of that, basically. Some of the more outrageous examples of overreach by labor movements, left-wing political activism, or, whatever political extremism you might be able to think of in those forms. So that phenomena is recurring, right? You can kind of see that in India right now. You can see a resurgence since the 1990s when the economy was deregulated and growth took off, of a kind of traditionalist, conservative, Hindu supremacist strain of politics that had kind of previously already existed and had existed for a while, but had been somewhat subdued before economic growth took off. But once things took off, then you started seeing the revanchism. You started seeing people being threatened by the changes, and also trying to look for something to kind of make themselves stand out. That's another aspect of these sorts of traditionalist movements that pop up with economic growth. It's not just about feeling threatened. For some people, It's actually about wanting to stand out, right? They want to predicate their identity on established prestige identities, which are generally traditional in nature. So,
Mm.
if you're like a high ranking, what's the word I want, caste in India, then if you get wealthy, one of the things you can do is act like a high caste guy and try to cement those norms. Because besides being wealthy, you also get extra social prestige from being high caste. And
Mm.
so, since that's a norm that helps you, you have an incentive to reinforce it. That's kind of overanalyzing to a degree. I don't think anybody sits down and thinks, oh, I'm going to propagate this beneficial social norm. More likely, they just like it, enjoy it, and actually genuinely believe it. People tend to have an easy time genuinely believing in social norms that are beneficial to them. So it's not a stretch to say that they're not lying when they say they think it's a good social norm. That is to say, in India's case, the caste system to varying degrees.
Mm.
So obviously in Europe, they had fascism. That was a similar dynamic. It was kind of half discomfort and outrage at some of the liberalization significant liberalization that had happened in Europe over the course of the late 19th, early 20th century. And then the other half of it was people trying to cement traditional identities and uphold those as prestige identities via authoritarian means. So again, this is something that happens in every society that has experienced substantive economic growth, industrialization, and urbanization. Here in the United States, we have a lot of conservatives who live in urban areas. Generally, they're a minority, but they do exist and are a decent chunk of the voter base in urban areas. And they tend to kind of fancy themselves traditionalists, but kind of like traditionalists in other societies, the degree to which they hew to that is kind of transactional. When it's beneficial, it tends to be more pronounced, but other aspects that are seen as more backwards tend to be left behind. Again, these people are still urban in outlook and nature. So when they tend to pick out things from the traditional culture they like, it tends to be things that don't really contradict the way they live already. And that's not a knock against conservatives. Again, this is just like a broad pattern. People pick out the aspects of the identity they like and discard the ones that they don't. You can see that in how a lot of urban nationalists treat religion. In a lot of parts of Europe, for example. Let's go with Greece in this case. In Greece, Greek nationalism is intrinsically tied to the Orthodox Church, right? It's not the only aspect of Greek nationalism, but it's a big part of it, because Christianity has been a big part of the Greek identity over the course of the nation's history. And it probably won't surprise you to know that a lot of urban Greek nationalists are not like the most religious people. They identify with it. They support the norms. They try to practice them, but they don't really practice all of them, and they don't go out of their way to practice them very consistently. How often do they actually go to church? Probably varies pretty considerably from person to person. So that's what we're talking about. This is a kind of culture war that comes out of the changes wrought by economic development. And those identity wars, as we've seen recently in the United States, can be, as persistent as they are annoying. They can be very annoying. So yeah, that's sort of the dynamic that plays out with economic growth. You see both left-wing, modern left-wing type politics emerge at the same time that you would see the backlash emerge conservatively. Traditionalism, actual rural style traditionalism, as it had historically been practiced in whatever country this is happening again, that tends to kind of fade away. The actual norms generally were functional at one point in history, and served a purpose, and in addition to being taken seriously by the people practicing them. But as societies urbanize, generally those traditional norms lose their function, and it becomes harder and harder to maintain them in the face of contradicting circumstances. Generally when circumstances change, you need new norms. But when a norm has been in place for hundreds of years or thousands of years, that's a tall order. Like, it could be very difficult to get people to break the habit.
Yeah. Chat saying they knew a very proud Greek from work who would fall into a mild depression if the fall of Constantinople was mentioned.
Yeah, they're still bitter about it. Would have been interesting if they'd been able to keep it. Russia tried to get it at one point, It was kind of the sort of the stretch goal of the late Russian Empire to try to retake Constantinople and have it be the center of Orthodox Christianity again. I guess it never technically stopped being the center, but it wasn't controlled by a Christian power, so there was a limit to how much freedom and discretion they had. Yeah, that was around the late 19th century. And the trouble that they had is that Britain and France did not want Russia basically just blowing into southeastern Europe and conquering everything. They saw that as threatening to their interests in the region, as well as just to their, general power on the continent in general. Their power on the continent generally, rather. So they actually allied with Turkey against Russia in that period. And that was what allowed the Turkish government to avoid collapse. Technically, it would have been the Ottoman Empire at the time, so I should say Ottoman government. Yeah, the Ottoman economy was not doing well in the 19th century, so they actually depended pretty heavily on loans and other forms of support from Britain and France. So if Constantinople is not presently controlled by a Christian power, you can blame the preeminent Christian powers of the UK and France for that, because if not for them, there's a decent chance that the Turks would have lost Constantinople to the Russians at one point. It's kind of a long, wild, meandering answer. I'm not even entirely sure how we got to that.
We were talking about Islam and moderation of Islam. And then we got around to the different areas where Islam has been. We got to the Greeks, got to Constantinople.
It always comes back to Constantinople.
Good old Constantinople, the Christian power that many people forgot about. For the kingdom.
Those poor Byzantines.
Yep. They tried their best.
They tried. They hung on for a long time. But in the end, they just didn't have enough gas left in the tank to persevere. I think the city had a vastly shrunken population by the time it fell. It was down to like 50,000 people or something.
Wow.
Yeah. Still had the walls, just didn't have the people. Certainly didn't have any defense against huge-assed cannons.
They brought cannons to that fight?
Yeah, it was one of the first... Well, I'm not going to say it was the first use of cannons in European warfare. Obviously, they've been used before. I just don't know the specifics. But certainly one of the most famous early uses of cannons in the history of European warfare was then the fall of Constantinople. Because the city had giant, huge-ass walls. During the height of its success and power, they'd been able to afford just vast fortifications. So even at the end of the empire's sort of useful life, right, even at the end when they were much weaker, those fortifications were still formidable. So in order to penetrate them, the Ottomans actually trotted out some huge-ass cannons in order to break them. And that was actually the main way they were able to get through. If not for that, they would have had a much tougher time, even with the city's much shrunken population. Yeah, I think somebody in chat had some trivia about that. They were saying that... what was it? They were like cast in some special way or something. I don't recall exactly. I need to follow up on it. But they had some cool trivia that they shared a couple weeks ago about it.
Chat saying that they were huge cannons.
Yeah. Yeah, they had to be. Those walls were thick.
It's interesting when you have those technology breakthrough for a military that gives it the ability to break some defense that didn't exist before.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, warfare is always kind of a tit-for-tat escalation between stronger defenses and then new technology that allows you to break those defenses. So, case in point. And the trouble with cannons, though, is that they're very expensive. Back in that time, the gunpowder had to be specially made. It took specially skilled labor to cast the cannons. It was not cheap. And that's to say nothing of buying the ammo. Obviously cannonballs had to be crafted individually back then too. So, you had to be a pretty decently wealthy empire to afford a whole bunch of them. Unfortunately for the late Byzantines, that's exactly what the Ottomans were.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, was it the Ottomans by then? Yeah, it would have been the Ottomans by then. Yeah, the Seljuks were already long gone by then. Technically, the Ottoman Empire started out as the Seljuk Empire. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But then the Seljuks got absolutely fucking wrecked by Tamerlane, or Timurid, whatever you want to call him. He was a big Central Asian warlord that tried to emulate his hero Genghis Khan by going on a big spree of conquests around the world, such as it was known to him at the time. Yeah, he actually did something Genghis Khan did not do, which was invade India successfully.
Huh.
Yeah, the Mongols didn't really focus too much on it. They were more interested in China, the Middle East, some of Eastern Europe. Those were more their areas. But South Asia didn't really happen for them. I think they pushed at one point, but they were actually defeated because the empire in control of northern India at the time, I think it was one of the Delhi sultanates, they were actually themselves descended from a Central Asian people that had conquered northern India at one point. And so they actually were very familiar with the kinds of warfare that the Mongols practiced, which were very cavalry centric and very mobile. And so that gave them an edge in the battle that a lot of the people the Mongols fought back then did not have. So they were able to use that to defeat the Mongols, and so India was spared the same kinds of conquest that the Mongols inflicted on other regions. Until Tamerlane. And then they got the same experience anyway. Just 100 or so years later than everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Although I would point out again that the Delhi Sultanate was formed by Central Asian peoples invading India, so they were actually already going ham on northern India centuries before that. Yeah, medieval India was a pretty gnarly place. I don't think you would like it. Lots of Central Asian assholes just kind of rolling in and killing shit tons of people while looting the wealthiest civilization on the planet. It was not a fun time for anybody.
Doesn't sound so.
No.
I don't know if I've heard of Tamerlane much. It wasn't really... Was it a particular country he was from?
I think he was Uzbek. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly, but I want to say he was ethnically Uzbek. But keep in mind, ethnicity in medieval Central Asia was kind of amorphous. People tended to blend together a lot. So, for example, the high culture in Central Asia in its medieval period was actually mostly Persian. So what you'll hear a lot of if you study the region, certainly India's history, since they kind of overlap, is the phrase Persianized Turk. So pretty much all of the main ethnic groups in Central Asia are Turkish in origin. They're not all like the same ethnicity of Turkey, of the main groups in Turkey itself, but they're all part of the same family, ethnologically speaking. And while they kind of had different dialects and whatnot, they were all kind of unified by the fact that everybody looked up to the Persians. So, if you were urban, or if you were not urban but wealthy, then generally you would be educated in the Persian language, in Persian literature, in Persian science. Basically you would just get a fancy Persian education, because if you were well off, that was the best education you could get. And so the result is that while the people were Turkish, the elites all spoke Persian and were generally of a Persian cultural bent. Again, it was a blend. It was Turkish and Persian culture blended together, but there was definitely a strong Persian preference by the elites. It's kind of like the elites in the UK and how they kind of leaned French just because of the Norman invasion. Kind of a similar dynamic in a way, although in Central Asia's case, the Persians didn't really invade so much as they just kind of culturally colonized it because they were so advanced. Do not underestimate Persian administration, Neuro. It was very good. They were very smart people. So there's a reason their culture was looked up to. They were quite effective and highly intelligent in the ways of governance, administration, and science, by the standards of the day, anyway. So anyway, all of these Persianized Turks and whatnot, they tended to define the elites, and so Tamerlane was probably very similar. So I think he was technically ethnically Uzbek, but more likely he was heavily Persian in terms of his customs, practice, language, etc.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's actually kind of where Hindi, the language, comes from, because these Persianized Turks invaded northern India, basically colonized it, is the word we would use today probably. And when they did, they formed the elite strata of Indian society in northern India. And I guess I'm talking here mostly about the Mughal Empire. And so what the Mughals did is that around their capital, New Delhi, well, not New Delhi, Delhi at the time, they decided that they needed to find some kind of language that they could use that would act as a common language between rulers and people so that they could all understand each other. Because, most people in India at the time didn't speak Persian or Turkish languages for that matter. So in order to resolve that, they decided to basically create a court language in which all of the different peoples, like, the local nobles and whatnot, who were Indian and spoke Sanskrit language or languages descended from Sanskrit, a common language those people could use with the rulers who had come from abroad. And what they decided to go with was a local dialect of Hindustani, right? Basically, the local dialect of Hindi, which was around Delhi, which I believe was called Garibaldi Hindi. And they mixed that local dialect of Hindi with Persian and Turkish language. So there's a lot of loan words from Turkish and Persian that were mixed in on top of the vocabulary and grammar. It's basically the foundation of the language is Hindi, or Hindustani rather, and then they have loan words from other languages, kind of added on top. So that formed the basis for what came to be known as Urdu. Again, that was the court language they decided on to be the kind of lingua franca between rulers and ruled. And Urdu became a major language in northern India. Like, it became like the prestige language. If you were educated, you basically had to learn it. And there was an immense amount of literature that also was printed in Urdu, such that became not only the language of administration, but also just of art, so to speak, in general. Literature and art were mostly Urdu for a very long time in northern India. So, skip ahead. The British obviously invade, English becomes very prominent, but Urdu is still an important language in northern India anyway, just because it's so ensconced in all of the regions of northern India. So what happens is that the late 19th century, there's an Indian independence movement that crops up, which is led by Indian nationalists. And these nationalists did not want English to be the main language of India. When India became independent, they wanted to have a native language be the national language. And the main, most commonly spoken language in India at that time, across northern India mostly, but also some southern India, was Urdu. And so people said, okay, well, if we're going to have a national language, let's go with Urdu. Why not do that? And a lot of Indian nationalists actually were opposed to that. They didn't want to do that. And the reason was because Urdu itself was actually mostly foreign, right? The base of the language was native Hindustani, again, the Garibaldi dialect, but it had so many loan words from Persian and Turkish that they saw it as being more foreign. And keep in mind, again, like, the Mughal Empire was itself a colonizing force in India, right? Maybe they didn't do as much damage in some ways as the British did while they were there, but they were still foreigners, technically. And so Indian nationalists looked at that and said, I'm not really comfortable with that. So what they did instead of using Urdu as the national language is that they actually took Urdu, which again, everybody, most people in northern India already spoke. And what they did is they systematically removed all of the loan words from Turkish and Persian. And they replaced them, again, very purposely, with Sanskritized words. In other words, they took Old Sanskrit, which is the root language of most every language in northern India, and some in southern India, and using those root Sanskrit words, they tried to create, again, out of whole cloth, they just engineered this. They tried to create new words that would have the same meaning as the previous foreign loan words that they were trying to remove. And that was a project they actually finished. And the result is what is now called Hindi, the main language of India. Again, one of the several official languages. It's not an organic, like, naturally occurring language. It was actually engineered by Indian nationalists in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
They engineered to be easier to pick up.
No, didn't have anything to do with it. It had only to do with pride.
Oh.
They didn't want the language to be foreign or to have significant foreign influence. They just wanted something that would be completely native, that they could call
They wanted to go old
absolutely.
school, so they weren't influenced by others. Gotcha.
Yeah, they wanted it as nationalists to be unequivocally native in construct and origin.
Mm-hmm.
And so they adjusted the pre-existing lingua franca so that it would be that, so that it would fit that role as an unequivocally native language. And so Hindi is the result.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
It's another meandering answer. I think we were talking about Central Asia.
There's one similarity that's coming to mind, and that's that Icelandic is the closest to Old Norse of the Scandinavian languages, even though it was the most recently settled of the locations. Because when it was settled, a lot of people who were more purists of their ways, and they were like writing the ancient scripts and so on and collecting them there, it kept them more rooted to the original language and identifying with the original language. Maybe Chat knows better, but I think that's how it is. Icelandic is the closest to Old Norse, maybe for those reasons.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a similar dynamic with American English and British English.
Mm-hmm.
You know, supposedly, American English is closer to the original English spoken in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, kind of diverged in the 19th century because of changes in how English was taught amongst the elite communities in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the new the new dialect that was sort of pushed and created became like the prestige dialect, and so everybody shifted to that. But we didn't really have that here in the States, so
Is that called received pronunciation?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. They kind of started dropping the R's very purposely. So some of that caught on here. You can see that in like the Boston Brahmin accent in the Northeast. You know, educated families in Northeastern America used to send their kids to special schools, and they tended to use that kind of dialect that became prominent in England. So they kind of had a similar affectation in their English. But it didn't spread much beyond that. We don't really like elites here in the United States, famously so. So we're perhaps not as influenced by prestige dialects and other prestige type things. You know, we prefer things to be as dumbed down and stupid as possible. Perhaps that's uncharitable. Perhaps it would be better to say that we prefer the people's touch. That's certainly how it's generally framed here. And to be fair, that does have the benefit of denying the elites in the United States a degree of cultural power that they would certainly abuse if they had it. Certainly they do in the Britain. I can't believe they still have a House of Lords.
Do you have to be a lord to have a seat there?
You have to have some kind of credential. I don't think you have to necessarily be a lord. I don't think that's a prerequisite.
You must be a lord or an earl or a baron.
Yeah, I think you can be. I think you can be appointed, actually. Technically, I think that's one of the newer changes that they implemented.
Interesting. Chat saying that the language trend of the older version being spoken in the newer place is the same for French in North America.
Oh, really?
It's like French Canadian.
Quebecois.
Yeah.
Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm always getting it wrong, so I'm paranoid. Yeah, the French spoken in Quebec, I think, is supposed to be more reminiscent of courtly French as spoken in the 1600s, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I'm remembering. Yeah, it kind of has a folksy sound to it, according to people from France.
Yeah.
From what I've read.
Kind of country almost. Jabito says lords are lifetime appointed positions. Damn. What's the average age of a lord in the house? When do you become a lordship and not just a boy? Your
Yeah.
lordship?
Yeah, they keep talking about reforming it, but then the reforms are always like super mild.
Mm-hmm. In a way, I feel like British sentiment is that they love their traditions too.
Yeah, traditions are great, but there comes a point when you've got to
Yeah.
update your institutions.
Yeah.
Like lots of people are critical of the House of Lords, even in the UK. It's not an especially representative institution.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, for all I shit on the United States, I think we do that right. I think it's actually pretty good that we're kind of a peasant culture. We were kind of founded and populated by people from the lower strata of European society. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously that has its downsides, but I think we do have a much greater degree of immunity from elite bullshit than a lot of civilizations that are older do.
Mm-hmm.
So that is at least something we can credit ourselves with. We do manage elite bullshit much better, I would argue. Even than France. France has a reputation for being very left-leaning and for being very pro-labor, but if you start paying attention to French politics, you'll start noting that a lot of the leaders of those left-leaning parties are themselves kind of imperious in terms of their outlook and governance. It's certainly been one of the main criticisms of the establishment parties in French politics.
Mm-hmm.
They feel very out of touch. They feel very insular. A lot of them have similar backgrounds. A lot of them come from decent families, maybe not necessarily super wealthy families, but generally like upper middle class families that manage to get their kids into the main. What is it? There's this one university in France that trains most of their civil servants. So that's a very prestigious school if you can get into it. So a lot of their politicians are actually graduates of that school.
Hmm.
And that's great, but again, people feel that there's a lot of distance between themselves and their representatives now because of that. Because most people obviously, don't graduate from like super fancy universities. So the days of having a political leader who themselves came from like a relatively humble background and has been struggling in the trenches, fighting for this, that, or the other cause, you don't see that as much now. Now it's much more technocratic, and that's actually one of the determinants of the political instability in French politics in particular, although you see similar dynamics in other societies in the West.
Someone in chat said, "Tell me something about ancient Greece."
They actually invented a working computer.
Really?
Yeah, have you ever heard of that?
No.
Yes, they found it in a shipwreck in the Mediterranean. I'm trying to move it somewhere, I guess, but yeah, it was like a fully tricked out. Obviously, it wasn't like a computer like what we're using now. It wasn't like a digital computer with semiconductors and that stuff, but it was a mechanical computer that could do basic computations. And apparently it did work. Yeah, never think that because people lived a long time ago that they were stupid. Actually, generally very, very smart. Having less technological advancement behind you doesn't mean you're any less able to innovate or come up with creative solutions. And the ancient world is just full of examples of that. So yeah, ancient Greece, for one such example, mechanical computer. There you go.
Sweet. They're calling it the Antikythera thing.
Oh, I don't remember. I for sure don't remember the name. But I do remember reading about it a long time ago.
Nice.
Yeah, there's lots of cool stuff that people find in shipwrecks. Generally, it's pretty well preserved, especially in the Mediterranean, because I think there is something about the lower reaches of the Mediterranean that makes the waters there more preservative. Or maybe I'm thinking of the Black Sea. I don't recall all of a sudden.
The Black Sea is very salty, so that would be preservative.
There you go. Maybe that's it. So yeah, ships that sunk way back when, you can still find the stuff they were carrying in pretty decent condition because of that. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, maritime archaeology is a fun one. I feel like we'll find some really cool stuff in the future, and that because of that particular field.
True, the ocean floor is vastly unexplored.
Yeah, I think well, there's two examples I can think of cool stuff. For one, think of the city of Alexandria. So it
Mm-hmm.
was a major port city in the ancient world, and then there was a huge ass earthquake that actually caused a huge chunk of the front of the port, as well as big chunks of the city on the coastline, to actually just straight up fall into the ocean, or maybe slip into the ocean would be the right word. But
Mm.
regardless, all of that shit ended up in the water. And nobody really knew what happened to it or what was down there until marine archaeologists started doing dives and recovering it. And they found some pretty neat stuff, intact statues, documents, in pretty decent condition. So, yeah, that was a really good way to get a snapshot of the city as it was at that time, rather than having to rely on records and whatnot. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, the stuff that survived the earthquake has aged considerably, just because of wear and tear. So the stuff
Mm-hmm.
in the water was somewhat better, in better shape, better preserved. So that's one cool thing marine archaeologists do. The other cool thing, and they haven't done as much of this, but this is the thing I'm more interested in. They go to areas that had been above, what's the word I want? Sea level. That's the word I want. So sea levels used to be considerably lower, like thousands and thousands of years ago, and then they rose considerably, and in relatively short order. So what marine archaeologists have done is go into those areas that had been below sea level, but had been above sea level rather, but are now below sea level. And they're starting to look at the human settlements that had actually emerged there to try to study some of the earliest examples of human civilization.
Hmm.
Yeah, humanity tended to kind of hew towards the coast when it expanded out of Africa. So, but at that time, the sea level was lower. So a lot of the earliest settlements have probably been lost, because of the big increase in sea level that occurred thousands of years later. So marine archaeologists are kind of interested in that and trying to dig up what they can. They've already found some cool stuff in what they call Lapland. Is that what it was? Or Dog? I don't remember the name. Basically, the territory between the UK and Norway. I think a lot of that used to be above sea level, right? Because right now, obviously, the UK is an island, but originally it was not an island. It was actually connected to continental Europe. And so marine archaeologists have actually explored settlements. They've looked for and found settlements under the water, that are just ancient, very old, in that area. And it's some of the earliest examples they've found of human habitation in the region.
Hmm. Just
And there's
thought that
similar.
it used to be like anti-Florida, where it's like a cold peninsula instead of a warm, swampy one.
There you go. And they've also done that kind of work in the Black Sea, because the Black Sea originally had a much lower sea level as well.
Doggerland, it's called.
Yeah, I think that's it. Something like that.
Hmm.
Kind of a funky name. Yeah, I've even read that there's some theory that the Black Sea's sea level may have stayed lower for much longer than, say, the oceans outside, because the Black Sea was not originally connected to the Mediterranean. The Bosphorus was originally like just rock. There wasn't a canal running through it like there is now. And so the theory went that eventually that barrier eroded until eventually the Mediterranean started flowing into the Black Sea and flooded it. And the speculation is that that flood may have happened very quickly and may be the basis for some of the flood myths that are common in various folklore and literature traditions amongst cultures in the region. Some would even say the biblical story is descended from that folklore that predated the Bible.
Yeah, it kind of depends on your interpretation of that, because I come from the religious tradition that it was the Bible that was the first tradition, just in general.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're taking it from a dry scientific worldview, it would be lots of different traditions in the region, different reincarnation myths and things like this for Christianity, for example, that led up to the ideology of Judaism or Christianity. And Judaism had a key edge over its predecessors in being written down, like writing down a document and agreeing on a set code and saying this is now our definitive text is something that is pretty hard to do and get people to agree on. So, interesting notion.
Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah. As we like, we can wrap and swap over to see what's happening in Faerun.
Let's see. I guess I don't really have anything that can't wait for next week. I certainly don't really have any more news. Obviously, I can drone on about, just random things for a very long period of time. But beyond that, I don't have any further news items or whatnot.
Gotcha. Well, I'm in a match maybe over soon. We'll see.
Oh, okay. Have you ever heard of Alien Dark Descent?
Is that a game or?
Yeah, it's a game. It's
no, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's pretty decent. I've been playing it for the past week or two.
Nice.
It almost feels like a tabletop game that got adapted into a computer game. It's an interesting take. It almost kind of defies classification. It's got RPG elements, it's got tabletop elements, XCOM type elements, whatever you want to call that genre. Yeah, they kind of just added a lot of cool stuff together, and it came together pretty well. It had kind of been on my wish list for a while, but I'd been trying to talk myself out of buying it. To the point that I actually watched an extended YouTube video that had all of the cinematics, because I figured if I just watch the story, then I'm not going to be as interested, because I'll know what happens. That was a trick I developed in grad school to try to stop myself procrastinating by watching TV shows. If I spoil the ending, then I'm not going to watch it, so that I can get back to work. So that's what I did, and it kind of made me curious about what was between the cutscenes. Because obviously in a video game, there's a lot of story that happens in between the cinematics in the actual gameplay. So then I watched a YouTube video that included a full playthrough that had the actual gameplay, and I actually liked it enough that I just bought it. So mission failed. Mission utterly failed. I got it and started playing it finally. And it has been pretty enjoyable. The occasional jank aside, it is pretty good.
Nice. You said it's Alien Dark Descent?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, some of the recent alien-themed computer games have been decent. I think Fireteam Elite was pretty well reviewed. I'm not mistaken. I'm a little burned out on co-op shooters, so I'm probably not going to try that one. But I do appreciate that it had better reviews. It's nice to see something positive come out of the video game division of the Alien franchise.
Yeah. I dipped my toes into Alien Isolation during my last subathon.
Yeah, I saw you playing that. What did you think of that?
It's pretty cool. I liked that it felt like a pretty straightforward game and super fitting with the first movie for the flow of action and how long it takes for aliens to actually appear and having a very moody, spooky set of environments. It wasn't all a whole bunch of stuff jumping out at you. It was tense situations. And then certain rooms where you're actively trying to avoid an alien, but being on a derelict vessel and trying to link up with other humans and not knowing who you can trust and stuff, it had a bunch of buildup that I didn't expect. I thought it was going to be more constant jump scares, but maybe there end up being more later on. But it's a game that has a cult following, apparently. They really love it.
Oh, cool. I think I got that one in a humble bundle. I just haven't gotten around to it yet.
We got one more question, and then we can wrap this week's episode. It said, what is your take on AFD's projected win in Thuringia? That's the alternative for Deutschland.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything to say about it that you haven't already heard, which is that it's just further progress for the whatever you guys want to call it. I feel like I get yelled at whatever I call it. The far right, the alt right, populist forces, like whatever you want to frame the AFD as. The fact that they've done well in Thuringia and I think Saxony too, that just speaks to their continued progress in ascendancy. And so that just speaks to the degree to which the forces of, maybe I shouldn't say traditionalism, but at this point, that's basically what they are. The forces that want to defend traditional notions of liberal democracy in Germany have an increasingly uphill battle trying to preserve those kinds of norms and institutions. But like I said last time, the fact that they're doing well in Thuringia and Saxony also isn't all that big a deal, because these are some of the poorer, more backwards regions. These are parts of what had been East Germany that never fully recovered from the communist period or the reunification period. And their experience is kind of unique to Germany. You generally don't see nearly as much angst, politically or socially, in other states of Germany, especially those that were not part of what had been East Germany. Perhaps I should say the GDR, the German Democratic Republic. Regardless, I think it's a problem overall, but it's not a catastrophe either. And I suspect that political forces in Saxony and Thuringia are still going to go out of their way to try to form a coalition that excludes the AfD. So it may be that even with all of the votes they've gotten, they still don't have enough. So yeah, don't get too overwrought about it, I guess, is my main takeaway. It's a problem, but it's not any more of a problem than it really was before.
That's fair. Well, cool. Thank you for breaking things down for us, Sire, and thank you, chat, for your questions, and thank you, Fuzzycord, for handing them along. And with that, we will call this another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Agent Smith, thank you always for coming on.
Oh, thank you. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.